Thanks for joining us on the Cultured Meat and Future Food podcast. We're excited to have Dr. Bianca Lay as the guest for today's episode. If you are a regular listener and have heard our New Harvest Fellowship series, Bianca is on the team to make that series possible. Dr. Bianca Lay is a cell biologist and Honorary Fellow in Agriculture and Food at the University of Melbourne. Bianca completed her PhD at the Biomedicine Discovery Institute at Monash University and is currently the Director of Cellular Agriculture Australia, a nonprofit dedicated to promoting and accelerating R&D in the cellular agriculture industry. When Bianca's not doing science, she talks and writes about it. She's an experienced science communicator and has contributed to various national policy projects spanning diversity in STEM workplaces, waste management, and science diplomacy at the Academy of Technology and Engineering. Earlier this year, Bianca was one of the 60 STEM experts in Australia selected as part of the Superstars of STEM, a nationally funded program to elevate the public profile of prominent women in STEM. This was a super exciting episode. I always have a pleasure chatting with Bianca and the rest of the Cellular Agriculture Australia team. Let's jump right in. Thanks for joining us on the Cultured Meat and Future Food Show. We are very excited to have Bianca Lay on this episode. Bianca is someone who has actually been involved with the podcast in many different ways, things that we'll discuss shortly. But with that being said, Bianca, I'd like to welcome you to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Alex. It's nice to be on this side of the mic.
So there's definitely a lot to talk about, and we have regular meetings, so I feel like we actually interact with each other quite a bit, even though we're in totally different parts of the world. But for those who are just listening in now, tell us a little bit about your background and when you actually got started hearing about cellular agriculture.
Sure. So I'm a cell biologist. My entire career in science has been in the biomedical field of research. So I finished my PhD last year, right at the start of the pandemic. And my PhD was looking at the effects of premature birth on heart development. So if you're born more premature, we've found out that you're more susceptible to developing long-term heart diseases later in life. So my bread and butter is looking at cells in the body. During my PhD, I also volunteered for a group called Effective Altruism Melbourne. So for those of you who don't know, Effective Altruism is a social movement / research field dedicated to doing the most good with your limited resources. So whether that's time, money, or career capital. And through Effective Altruism, I found out about, it was called clean meat back then, and just got so excited about this new field of research. I was actually listening to Bruce Friedrich's interview with Rob Wiblin on 80,000 Hours and just could not believe it that I hadn't heard of this field before. It was just amazing to know that I could use and apply my existing cell biology research skills into food science, something that I never thought I could do. And just the fact that it's such an effective way to solve so many of the world's greatest issues, it was incredibly appealing to me. So I knew for a while, that was about 3 years ago, I think, I knew that I wanted to get involved in cell ag after my PhD. Now, I mentioned that I finished my PhD right at the start of the pandemic, and a lot of the job opportunities at the time were overseas. Unfortunately, I couldn't go overseas after my PhD, so it really forced me to look at the field of cell ag in Australia. At the time, there wasn't much happening. There were 2 companies, there was Vow and Heros, and it just surprised me that there wasn't more happening in Australia. So it really encouraged me and inspired me to get Australia on the map, trying to encourage researchers from getting involved. And that's basically the start of my journey as the founder of Cell Ag Australia.
We hear a lot about effective altruism on this show, but we never really talk about it in detail. And as I had just mentioned, like a lot of people have either heard about cellular agriculture through EA or they're involved within the industry because of effective altruism. And so effective altruism has some really good examples as to why it's more effective or how you can be more effective. And I want to direct that question to you as to, for those listeners who haven't heard about effective altruism, do you have any examples that really hit home on why it's important?
Sure. So as a scientist myself, I use evidence and numbers and data to inform a lot of the decisions we make in the lab. However, human beings are much more complex than that, and behavior is really complex. So when it comes to, say, giving money to charities, for example, we don't think about which charity is the most effective, which charity saves the most amount of lives per $100. We just think, oh, I really care about this cause because it makes me really emotional, therefore I'm going to donate money to that charity. Typically, the charities that are most effective in terms of saving lives or improving quality of life aren't the ones that get a lot of media attention. So malaria, it's not a disease that you often hear about, but it actually affects a lot of people in developing countries. And so donating to those charities that provide malaria bed nets to families and remote communities is actually a really simple yet effective way to save lives. I bring up the cause area of cellular agriculture being a really effective way to save animals' lives. A lot of people think that doing animal activism or encouraging people to eat less meat is typically how they get involved in the field. That's how they donate their time and their money. But actually, it's not the demand that we need to change, it's the supply. We make these products better for the environment and better for animals' lives. And that was how I got involved in cellular agriculture through effective altruism.
Great. Yeah. And I think the malaria net example is a very good one. And often one I hear in conjunction with that is the same amount of money can help somebody, for example, within the US get a prosthetic leg, which improves that person's quality of life slightly. They're still alive and they're not going to die, for example. But then the same amount of money can be used to actually save many more lives using that money for malaria nets and that kind of thing. And so that's a very interesting way to look at it. And I think from a philosophy standpoint, we do see a lot of nonprofits that are using that effective altruism philosophy. Would you say, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but would you say Cell Ag Australia is an EA organization? Not officially, of course.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wouldn't say we are affiliated with effective altruism, either officially or even in a philosophical point of view, but we do borrow from a lot of the principles that EA is based on to determine the activities that we do. So we do tend to use a lot of the data from each of our projects that we are currently implementing and then deciding on whether that's an intervention that will be effective or something we should just scrap.
Okay, great. Yeah. And a lot of great things to pull from there. To step back a little bit, I want to reference what you said about finishing your PhD right around the time of the pandemic. Would you say that if the pandemic had not set in, perhaps you might be working for a company in the cellular agriculture space instead of taking the path that you did?
Yeah, and actually that was the plan for the longest time. I really wanted to work in one of the companies in the space as a scientist, as someone working in the lab. And it's funny that the pandemic has led to where I am today because I actually think that my current role has been way more effective and way more impactful than if I were to be working in a lab pipetting or culturing cells. I think what I'm doing now has had a huge effect on so many other people to get into the field. So really grateful for that change in pathways in my career.
So tell us a little bit about what you're doing now and what Cell Ag Australia does as an organization and really the inspiration behind Cell Ag Australia.
Sure. So for the first few months after my PhD, I didn't really think about starting Cell Ag Australia. I mostly just created the Twitter account so I could promote what was going on in the field. And through my journey with speaking to a lot of people, this was when Zoom was still very novel. So I managed to score meetings with some really busy and important people in the field. So that was great. I spoke to probably 50 people in the field to just get a better understanding of why was Australia behind, what were some of the major barriers that are preventing scientists from getting involved, and what is missing in the space. And through all those consultations and conversations that I had, I realized that there were three major barriers preventing Australia from being a huge player in the field. So one, there was this huge lack of a talent pipeline. People wanted to get involved in the field, but they didn't know how. There weren't existing courses, degrees, subjects for people to get qualifications. There weren't job boards showcasing what was going on in Australia. There wasn't an easy way for people to get involved. Number two was this lack of a middle person, a knowledge broker or a facilitator connecting different groups together. I was speaking to a whole bunch of different nonprofits in the space, and I said, oh, that's really interesting that you do this because I spoke to this person last week. Have you spoken to them? And more often than not, they hadn't spoken to each other. So I really wanted to use my skills as this knowledge broker to connect more people in the space together. And finally, there was this clear need for an organization or an expert to train the media on what this technology is, but more importantly, what this technology isn't. You see a lot of headlines. Back then, there weren't many headlines about cell ag, but the ones that did talk about cultivated meat, they called it lab-grown meat or fake meat or all these other words that were actually just inaccurate. We all know that cultivated meat won't be grown in the lab by the time it gets to consumers. So I just wanted to make sure that there was a science communicator in the field who could talk to the media and talk to members of the public to educate them on how this technology works. So Cell Ag Australia basically has evolved around those three pillars. So building a talent pipeline, connecting the communities together, and promoting public awareness of cellular agriculture.
Now, we are familiar with kind of the international efforts of the Good Food Institute and the Australia and APAC efforts of Food Frontier. Now, both of those organizations focus both on just alternative proteins in general, such as plant-based, but they also touch cellular agriculture. So how does Cellular Agriculture Australia fit in the puzzle piece along with some of these other key players in the space?
And they're both incredible organizations that are incredibly supportive of what we do. And I am huge fans of both those organizations before I started Cell Ag Australia. What I thought was still missing, though, was Australia is one of the best countries in the world to do stem cell research. So having someone in an organization that has a good understanding of how the Australian research sector works and who has connections with the regenerative medicine field in order to merge cellular agriculture and stem cell research together, that was definitely missing. And I did my PhD at Monash University, which is the home to the Australian Regenerative Medicine Institute, ARMI. So I thought that was a really great way to just get as many talented scientists involved in the field as possible. So yeah, we're essentially the science experts in the field to promote the research community in Australia.
That's great. And I think when we are talking about Australia, in addition to what you said about stem cell research in Australia, Australia is really a leader for the entire region for food and agriculture too. And we talk about this quite a bit on the show since there's a lot of folks from Australia that are involved in the industry. But can you shed some light on why Australia is such an important player in producing food for the entire Asia-Pac region?
Yeah, absolutely. So Australia is currently the second largest global exporter of beef. And we have this really strong relationship and reputation around Asia Pacific for developing really safe, high quality meat. We can leverage that reputation and that existing supply chain and those relationships and tie that with the new novel cultivated meat industry. The fact that we already have such close trade relationships with countries like China, countries like India and Singapore means that Australia is really well placed to do well in cellular agriculture.
So I recently spoke to somebody from a company called Matrix Meats, and their background and actually for the technology that they're working on in scaffolding does come from the medical field. And since your background in the academics setting was also in the medical field, I want to have some real talk here. Because we often hear that the cultured meat companies, the cellular agriculture companies are ready to go to market and they've figured out just a ton of these scientific quote unquote breakthroughs that allow them to come to market at crazy scale. But from what we know on either scientific talks and discussions and really how long things take in the medical world, I wanted to ask you, where do you see cell ag in the next 5 to 10 years? Is this something where we're going to have a lot of cultured meat product at, I think it's Coles, the grocery store in Australia? Where do we really stand? Are we at this kind of area where we are advancing the space, or will the science take longer? Any thoughts on that?
It is probably the number one question I get. When can we eat this product? How long will it take? Where will we be in X amount of years? I just want to start by saying I really don't want to speculate. Everyone's got their own number or answer to this question, and more often than not, they've been wrong. It's just really hard to predict how this technology is accelerating because a lot of the discoveries are being locked up in private companies. There is so much investment and so much hype in the private sector. Despite the fact that I'm in the field, I actually don't have a good understanding of which research questions have already been answered by which companies, which is why we at CellAg Australia have a huge emphasis on not just promoting the industry, because that's pretty well funded in the space, but promoting the basic research. So promoting the academics and the universities in getting involved in the space. So I personally don't have a good understanding of the technological process that's happening in each of these companies. And understandably, they're quite private about what their approach is in producing the meat. But I mean, in 5 years' time, it seems like there's going to be more of those proof of concepts like what we saw with Eat Just in Singapore. But will this reach to the mass market? I am not sure. I'm quite doubtful that it will in the next 5 years.
If the future researchers, or I should say maybe aspiring researchers, are starting to put more time and effort into this, then we will get to whatever kind of time period that is a lot sooner. So I want to use that as a way to segue into a tool that Cellular Agriculture Australia has created, which is the Pathways tool. Can you tell us a little bit about where the idea for Pathways has come from and really what the tool is?
Sure. So I spend a lot of my time talking to as many people as possible, talking to interested students, talking to industry professionals who work in adjacent fields, for example, in the life sciences space or in the food sector. The number one question I get is, how do I get involved? So there are two ways people approach this. One, they either are students and they haven't figured out what their majors are or what kind of subjects they should take in their final year to then specialize. So they want to know, what kind of subjects should I be doing or what kind of activities should I be doing to get myself a job in this space? The other type of person are people who have either been working in their respective fields for a long time, or they're in their final year or in their postgraduate degree, and they want to know, how can I use my existing skill set and apply it to this new industry? So based on those two audiences and all these conversations that I've had with these interested people, I often say there are so many research problems that you can apply your existing skills into. Or I say, do your research, do some reading. These are the research questions that the field is currently tackling. Based on whatever you're interested in, these are the kind of subjects that you should be taking, or these are the kind of experiences that you'll need to gain before getting a job in that particular area. Now, it is not very effective to have all these one-on-one conversations every day for months. So I wanted to really scale that effort by producing a resource that is interactive and helps users find their own way into the field. So after a lot of conversations with different people in the field who have had similar types of discussions with interested users, we've developed an online tool called Pathways to address these two audiences and these two questions. So it's a free to use tool. You can go to our website and it will be on our homepage at www.cellularagricultureaustralia.org. And it'll lead you to all of the research questions in the field and a whole bunch of majors in STEM. There are about 50 majors that we've included in the tool, and it links all of these research questions to each of those majors or fields within STEM. The next step is to expand this Pathways tool into non-STEM areas. So we know that there are more than just technical problems that we need to solve. It's not just figuring out the scale, figuring out the immortalization of cell lines. We also need to develop the supply chain. We also need to work on regulation. We need to work on understanding consumer perceptions of cultivated meat. So all of those skills are completely lacking in the field right now. So that's going to be the next step of this tool.
Great. And that's cellularagricultureaustralia.org, like mentioned. And we will also put the link to the main website as well as the Pathways tool in the show notes. Now, Bianca, I have a little bit of a sensitive question for you. And that's that if this tool was out before you were locking down your academic career path, do you think you might have gone into the cellular agriculture direction in a little bit more of a deeper way?
Yeah, I think having the tool at the point in my career where I wasn't sure which research questions or which areas in the field were really time sensitive, I think that would have led me to a academic research position. So actually doing a postdoc in the field. There were, or there still are, two organizations that are dedicated to funding academic research in the space. So New Harvest and the Good Food Institute. And I was definitely considering applying for a grant from these organizations, but honestly, I wasn't sure which research question I wanted to answer because I hadn't had experience in the field yet. So yeah, maybe it would have taken me down the academic route. It's hard to say now, considering the fact that I'm really enjoying my role at Cellular Australia.
And also a very kind of sensitive question to go back to the amazing work that you've already done. But hopefully this is really going to be something, or at least we've actually seen it already be something that is inspiring a lot of people to pursue a career in cellular agriculture.
Yeah, the feedback has been phenomenal, actually. I have had a lot of students find me on LinkedIn and say, this tool has been really great. How can I learn more? And yeah, I think that the team at Cellular Australia have done such a great job. And all the people that we've spoken to make this tool exist, we couldn't have done it without them.
So you've been able to accomplish quite a bit since you did graduate and just around the time of the pandemic. How big is the Cellular Agriculture Australia team, and how is that team structure organized?
So CellAg Australia is made up of an incredible team of volunteers. We have about 9 volunteers at the moment. They vary in their backgrounds. So there are some undergraduate students, there are some PhD students, there are some people working as software engineers or business developers. It's a really diverse team in terms of the expertise and the experience that everyone has. So that's been incredible to have so many unique individuals across Australia to get on board. We also have an advisory board. So we have people in industry in Australia as well as overseas, within the CellAg field as well as outside. So they are an incredible team to advise us on the strategic vision of CellAg Australia.
We've been seeing additional groups pop up throughout the world. Another group, for example, is Cellular Agriculture Deutschland, which services really all German-speaking countries in Europe. As we really see more of these groups and organizations pop up, what do you think is the best way to interact and collaborate with the different organizations?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And we're actually trying to figure that out right now. So we established an international cellular agriculture nonprofit consortium. It's a bit of a mouthful, where all of the nonprofits in the space, so yes, that includes CellAg France, CellAg Canada, CellAg UK, there's a group in New Zealand, trying to get all these nonprofits together where we can meet on a monthly basis and discuss some of the problems that we're having as a global industry, but also what are some of the regional differences that we have in our own countries and how can we put our heads together to help each other out. So we've got a Slack channel where we can share resources like our business plans, our fundraising strategies. We can talk about different visioning exercises and figuring out what is the best way to create the most impact as nonprofits. It's a really great group to just talk and meet people in the space. But yeah, as I said, we're still figuring out how we can collaborate as effectively as possible.
And I guess if I were to take that same type of question and apply it to Australia as a whole, what I've seen is that there's heavy collaboration between what's going on in Melbourne versus what's going on in Sydney. How often are you collaborating with different folks in the cellular agriculture space, really across the different cities in Australia?
Yeah, so I guess with the pandemic, we're collaborating much more than we would without having online Zoom talks. It's so easy now to just have conversations with people on the other side of the world, and it just makes Australia a lot smaller. So yeah, we're finding that a lot of academics across the country are really keen to get on board. And because there are only, as I said, 7 startups in the space, they are incredibly receptive to collaborating with academia and figuring out how we can tie the two private and public sectors together. It's been actually really fun to talk to a whole bunch of incredible professors in food science, in regenerative medicine, in tissue engineering, and putting their heads together and saying, there is this new research field that is getting so much attention. You can apply your existing skills, existing experiments into this new space. It's been really fun, and there are so many people who are keen to get involved.
From the standpoint of the general public within Australia, or even perhaps some of the farmers in Australia, do you have a gauge of how they take cellular agriculture? Is it something that they're open to? Is it something that maybe groups might be fighting against? Any insight you can share about that?
So CellAg Australia doesn't consult with a lot of farmers. We are mostly working towards getting the research field up and running in Australia. Food Frontier, as you mentioned before, Alex, they're a non-profit in the space working towards getting government on board, making sure that the regulatory space does not hinder the progress of the alternative protein industry. And I know that they've worked with farmers in New South Wales to kind of understand what their problems are, what are their concerns about this new space, but also how can they themselves get involved in the field. So yeah, they're a great organisation working on that problem right now.
Great. So we've really dug into what Cellular Agriculture Australia does as an organization, a little bit about your background and your academic interest leading to now, I guess, cellular agriculture interest. But as you were describing that, I really kind of got that sense of community from the Cellular Agriculture Australia Slack channel. And so maybe the question that I want to ask you is, tell me about the Slack channel and what kind of conversations are going on in the Cellular Agriculture Australia Slack channel.
Yeah, so we've developed a Slack channel to bring in a whole bunch of people from the community to talk about CellAg and basically hash out some of the concerns that the community may have about this new technology. So we've got a whole bunch of different people in the Slack channel. We've got scientists who are currently working in the existing CellAg companies. We've got researchers, so PhD students, honours students who are interested in starting a project in the space. But we also have just community members who do not plan to work in the field at all, do not want to work in the field, but they're just really excited about this new technology. And so some of the conversations in the Slack channel revolve around, okay, we know people have said and speculated that this technology is going to be impactful and positive, but are there any potential unintended consequences of this technology? What are they, and how can we mitigate those risks? So these are questions that are really difficult for even me to answer. So crowdsourcing some of the potential solutions has been so interesting. And I'm incredibly amazed at the community in Australia that is keen to get involved on an intellectual level, not as a way to get involved in the field, but to actually just talk about it and just be concerned about the future of food.
Yeah, and I think that's really exciting to see. And I think seeing conversations where people are interested in like peeking their head in the door to the industry and saying, oh, how does this work? Or maybe even answering some of those fundamental questions that they have in terms of how is this different from X, Y, and Z? I think that's really exciting. And I think you mentioned that how the Slack channel operates in a nice way. And I think we also are starting to see that a little in the general kind of corners of the internet. And I think you on the Slack channel mentioned something about the new Reddit, the subreddit, Where's the Beef, right? All these interesting comments like coming up and people just genuinely interested in the technology. And so the CellAg Australia Slack channel is also a good place for just those kinds of conversations too, would you say?
Absolutely. And we obviously don't just accept people in Australia. Anyone is welcome to join. So yeah, if you're interested in getting involved, you can just go to our website and click on the public Slack channel link there.
Cool. Yeah. And I was just taking a look at the website right now. Very easy to access. So if you're not part of that Slack channel, definitely check it out. We were alluding to something earlier about how we really, not just how we met, but also how we started working on the New Harvest podcast series together. And so do you remember how everything kind of came together?
Of course, I remember our very first conversation, Alex. I was reaching out to so many people in the field because I wanted to myself get involved. And Alex, I had been a huge fan, still am, of your podcast. And so I actually took a while to reach out to you because I knew you were very busy and I wanted to make sure I'd done my research before I reached out to you. But when I finally had the guts to message you and say, I really want to help out and get involved, you were so incredibly helpful and you'd connected me to a lot of people and you basically, were happy to help out in any way you could. In the same time frame, I'd also reached out to New Harvest because I wanted to help them out and volunteer for them. And that's where I met Mira. And Mira is just incredible. She was very happy to have me on board. And she said, oh, you've met Alex. Why don't we work together on this new podcast series that we're doing? And so for those of you who don't know, I help out with the transcript and help out with some of the new ideas with the fellowship podcast. And it's been so great to just have these fortnightly meetings to catch up and chat to you both, despite the fact that we've never met each other in person.
Right. Yeah. It was definitely, Mira, who originally kind of both you and me in the room together afterwards to connect everything up. And I really do feel like it's this little family meeting we have every 2 weeks to kind of talk about the industry. So.
Yeah.
Cool. And so as we wrap up, I just kind of wanted to really ask, how can people get involved with Cell Ag Australia? I know you said it's open to everyone. How do folks from the US get involved? If you're listening in from Australia, how does somebody from Australia get involved? What kind of opportunities are there to help out?
So I love talking to people. I'm more than happy to have people reach out to me on LinkedIn, send me a DM on Twitter, or send me a cold email and just say, I'm interested in getting involved. I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you about how I can help you out with your goals, whether you want to end up working in the space or you want to get more involved in the science communication side of things. I really like working out with my volunteers what kind of skills they can bring to the table, but also what kind of skills they'd like to gain working at Cell Ag Australia. So it's completely up to you on how you develop your volunteer position at Cell Ag Australia. In terms of people overseas who are interested in the space, again, I have very similar conversations, but I like to connect these people with people in their region. So is there a nonprofit existing in the space that you can reach out to? Are there other interested scientists or engineers or people working in the space that you can connect to? I've spoken to a lot of the people in the field, not just in Australia. So happy to just have a conversation and meet you if you're interested in talking to me.
Great. And I think we really can't close off the episode without talking about Lisa and how great Lisa is. And I remember when I first talked to Lisa, she was interested in just getting involved and learning more about cellular agriculture in general. And Lisa's a pretty big part of Cell Ag Australia. Is that right?
Correct. Lisa is such a gun. This organization would not have existed without her help and all of the work that she's put in. So she's a New Harvest seed grantee. She's currently working as an honours student at the University of Sunshine Coast, developing crayfish meat, looking at transcription factors in crayfish limbs. But she's also the secretary of Cell Ag Australia, an official role in our organisation. And she is just one of the most enthusiastic, intelligent and committed people I've met, not just in the field, just in general. And she's got such an interesting background. She started her Bachelor of Science only a few years ago, and she's been working in completely different fields for about 20 or 30 years before she got back into studying. So she's got a really inspiring story. And again, huge fan of you, Lisa.
Great. And there's a lot more stories that I'd like to get to here, but we will have more of an opportunity to get to them because we will be interviewing co-host style the seed grantees coming up. And so I'm sure we'll kind of learn more about really not only everyone we talk to, but how Cell Ag Australia is growing as an organization when we do that. So I'm pretty excited about that.
I'm so excited for it too, Alex. I think the New Harvest seed grantees are the unsung heroes of the grant program that they have. And it's just such a great way to get people involved in a short amount of time. So some of the projects vary between 6 months to a year, a great way to get junior scientists involved in the field. So really keen to have these conversations with you, Alex.
Bianca, it's been great chatting with you. Is there anything else that the audience should know about either Cell Ag Australia or announcements that you'd like to make before we close off?
I just want to share kind of my experiences in getting involved and reaching out to people. It has been so easy to reach out to anyone and just say, I'm really interested in learning more about your journey. How can I also get involved? I've never had anyone in the field say, sorry, too busy to talk to you. So if you find someone on LinkedIn or Twitter or you've watched a talk and you have been inspired by them, please don't hesitate to reach out to them, because 10 out of 10, they will say, absolutely, let's organize a Zoom meeting and let's chat. So please don't hesitate to reach out to people if you're keen to get involved.
Bianca, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cultured Meat and Future Food Show.
Thank you so much for having me, Alex.
This is your host, Alex, and we'll see you on the next episode.
This program was produced by H Media. We'll see you soon.